And if you've just tuned in, if you've literally just put on your radio, you'll want to hear this, that Nicola Sturgeon has actually been arrested, but she has not been charged. There's no sense that she's done anything illegal. She actually put herself forward for that to happen, and she's being questioned as we speak. Let's continue with our coverage of former SNP leader Nicola Sturgeon and her arrest. Joining me now is GB News presenter Nigel Farage. Nigel, thank you very much for joining me. Well, it's sudden news, but most are saying it's not surprising at all. What do you take from this?
Well, what a few days of midsummer madness. We've got Johnson, Trump, and now Sturgeon. I mean, the whole thing is quite extraordinary. Look, I thought, from the start of this that her husband, Peter Murrell, was probably in very real trouble. I mean, if you raise money, political money, for a very specific purpose, which they did, about 600 grand, to fight a referendum, and then spend the money on something else, you may have a problem. There is also the question of a camper van. So whether Nicola Sturgeon is being brought in, being asked to give a witness statement about what her husband did, or whether she's a suspect, it's a little bit too early to say. Either way, I think what you're seeing is nemesis following hubris in very, very short order, because she was riding high, absolutely the queen of the castle, bringing in her completely balmy trans legislation, not worrying about resignations. It was as if she'd reached that position of power where she didn't need to worry, and how quickly things have changed.
Well, Keir Starmer must be looking on this moment and thinking that this is his time, because it does seem as though everything is just coming together for him, and he's pretty much done very little for it, and a lot of the things he's put forward, he's rowing back on.
Yeah, look, I mean, Scotland, it's not long ago when the Labour Party were guaranteed 40 seats in Scotland, and they've gone from 40 down to 1, and it's hard to think they haven't got a prospect of getting between 20 and 30 seats at the next election. And that changes the whole arithmetic. This idea that maybe Labour would need coalition partners with the Lib Dems or whoever else it may be, I don't see it. I think all of this leads us directly towards a big Labour majority.
It does feel that way, doesn't it? I mean, the Conservatives are saying that actually the party, the SNP, should show some leadership and suspend Nicola Sturgeon, whereas the Labour Party is saying Humza must come clean about what he knew. If you've been a party leader before, what would you be doing if you were in Humza Yousaf's shoes right now?
Well, I would find out, she's currently in custody. I would find out immediately she was released, whether she was there simply as a witness to what her husband had done, or whether she's being held as a suspect. And if she is a suspect, then Yousaf has no choice, I view, to do the right thing and suspend her.
It would seem, well, obviously, as I said, a spokesperson for Nicola Sturgeon said that the former SNP leader voluntarily attended an interview with Police Scotland and that she would cooperate with the investigation. I mean, it just feels like there is a moment in politics, as you said, like a summer kind of madness, where all these big leaders and all these big charismatic figures are falling. And Humza Yousaf, really, I mean, looking at it, I don't think he can cut it. Do you think this is pretty much the end for the SNP?
Yeah, I think they had this meteoric rise, most extraordinary rise, and that had as much to do with the absolute weakness of the Labour and Conservative. Labour mired in corruption scandals north of the border for many, many years. The Tories completely disconnected from people north of the border. So into that vacuum came the SNP. But I think, well, number one, I don't see any prospect of Scotland leaving the United Kingdom. I'm pleased about it. Many of my friends are very cheesed off because they say ditch the Scots and cut 4p off income tax. But I think the union should be maintained. And look, the SNP won't lose all their support. There is a momentum for separation from the United Kingdom. They will still, whatever happens, they will still come back at the next election with a reasonable, maybe even considerable number of MPs. But as for them being in a position to push a second referendum, that now is for the birds.
And with regard, obviously, for Keir Starmer, he's the beneficiary of a lot of this, because I don't see any other parties that really are in a position, or that the Scottish people will vote for. They certainly won't be voting for the Tory party. Most people are probably not voting for the Tory party, even Conservative supporters themselves. Or do you think that, with regard to some of the policies that the Labour Party are rowing back on, Keir Starmer has come up with his, he's come up with this no more drilling of North Sea oil and gas. Do you think that he's now going to have to roll back again on yet another one of his ideas?
I was surprised by some of this. I thought he'd do a Blair and just say that let's not frighten the horses economically at all. Clearly, that North Sea ban on drilling was meant to be red meat to the left of the party. Let's pacify the left. Let's show ahead of the election that we're united as a party. There are no disparate voices, unlike the Tories, who are permanently in civil war. You're right, he is rowing back. But actually, this is about more than just Keir Starmer. This is the whole net zero agenda is beginning to unravel as people realise it's going to cost an absolute fortune and globally make no difference at all. So yes, it causes Starmer a problem, but equally it causes the Tory government a problem too, because they're the ones in government that have put much of this in place. And I mean, if anyone thinks there will be no more manufacture of internal combustion engines after 2030, forget it, there will be.
Of course. I mean, it seems a ludicrous policy, and most people will be rowing back on that one. Well, listen, Nigel, also joining me live is Martin Daubney, and I know Martin has a question for you as well, Martin.
Yeah, hello, boss. I just want to ask you, one of the illusions that the SNP also sell to the electorate is the prospect of rejoining the European Union. That also now must be an absolute tatters.
Well, the whole policy was crazy. I mean, how they were allowed in 2014 to call it an independence referendum, but all they wanted to do was substitute Westminster for Brussels. I could never, ever get my head around that. I guess it was the sheer laziness and capture of much of that Edinburgh-based Scottish media. Look, rejoining the EU as an out-there policy doesn't work. The danger, though, Martin, is that the Tories have made clear under Starmer that, number one, they don't want to get rid of any more EU rules. So we're so at the moment, we're so convergent with the EU rules that it makes the Labour government very easy to sign up once again to the single market. And then we say, well, we're taking their rules, but having no say. Maybe we'll have an associate membership. And then years on from that, maybe we'll go for membership. So there is a possibility that the Brexit fight may, I hope not, but it may happen again.
Well, we'll see. We'll stay with us though, because Nigel, I've also got the other Nigel here, Nigel Nelson. Nigel Nelson, I know you want to pose a question to Nigel.
Yeah, Nigel, would you think that things have changed since the 2014 referendum, which means that the Scots, should they want independence, do have a right to another referendum?
Once in a generation, Nigel, is once in a generation. We're not even a decade on from that. And it's funny, isn't it? I mean, Sturgeon, of course, opposed the result of a Scottish referendum and the result of a national referendum. No democratic referendum ever seemed to please her. No. Look, if you're going to have these big constitutional referendums, and it's right that we have them, I would have thought a generation should be defined as about 25 years, not a decade.
Yeah, Nigel, I want to ask you as well about this issue of North Sea oil. I mean, it's totemic. It was to Alex Salmond's economic model for independence, self-sufficiency through black gold. And yet here we are, the SNP committing economic self-harm by going down the net zero route, echoed by the Labour Party. But surely Scottish voters would welcome the prospect of prosperity, of cheaper energy, of cutting their ties from this green madness that's bankrupting ordinary people.
Yeah, I mean, Salmond had an argument here. All the oil's ours, we'll take the revenue, and that means we can be free and independent and self-funding. Now, there were all sorts of problems here, such as foreign companies that had invested, such as actually the fact that the English border went in that direction up the North Sea and not in that direction. But at least it was an economic argument for standing alone. Now, when it came the next stage of joining the euro, he got into trouble. Sturgeon ditched all of that for her alliance with the Scottish Greens and somehow told the world that wind power was going to make Scotland a prosperous country. I think the Scots have done so. Then, actually, do you know what? There are about 100,000 jobs in Scotland reliant directly or indirectly on the Sea Scottish oil and gas business. You work that out, population of 5 million people. Is it any wonder that the SNP are in the mess they're in?
Well, I mean, it's a huge thing, really, this particular moment, actually, in politics, with the whole issue of all these different things happening. Everyone's talking about a landslide Labour victory now, especially with this. This is probably the final nail in the Conservatives' coffin, even if they had some sort of opportunity. I think they're right. I think that's the end of it. And do you see a future for the Tory party now as well, looking at the situation that we find ourselves in now?
The last couple of weeks, we've been living in fantasy land with much of the Tory supporting media saying, oh, there's still a chance. There's still a 30% chance the Conservatives can win a majority at the next election. Forget it. It's gone. It's done. It's over. Trust has been broken. The Red Wall voters have already legally divorced themselves from the Conservative Party. Many will stay at home. Some will go back to Labour. And in the southern part of the country, all I get from people is, Nigel, I can't bring myself to vote for them. And there any argument the Tories have got. I had John Redwood on my show the other evening. So, John, why should I vote Conservative? Oh, because the others are worse. I'm sorry. I'm bored with all of that. I don't think there's ever been a moment, literally, not in my lifetime, where Westminster was more disconnected from the aspirations and fears of ordinary people than it is now. And 10 years ago, you know, I led the UKIP insurgency from nothing to 4 million votes and then on to the Brexit Party at over 5 million votes. And I do believe that we're beginning to move into the situation where an insurgency will come again, such is the level of dissatisfaction in the country. And this one could be a lot bigger than last time.
Well, I've got to ask you finally, really, about whether you see, because obviously with all the news of Boris Johnson, I couldn't let you go without asking you whether you see Boris Johnson potentially restarting a new party and maybe joining with you. Is that likely?
Well, I think Boris is finished in the Conservative Party. I think to trigger a by-election without facing the music, without arguing his corner in Parliament, and effectively gifting Uxbridge to the Labour Party, and then followed by a couple of mates, and who knows whether they'll stay Conservative or go Lib Dem or whatever. I mean, when you do that much damage, when you shoot your own side in the back, you may have your own fanatical following of supporters, but the truth is the party will turn against him. You know, already the Tory MPs calling it mutiny. Boris Johnson has run out of road with the Conservative Party, and the more he tries to foment civil war, the more they will loathe him and never allow him to stand again. So, if he wants to have a future in politics, it's got to be outside the Conservative Party, and that will be an attempt to completely reshape British politics. And he can try and set his own party up if he wants to, but I can promise you it's a very hard thing to do. I've done it more than once. And reform is there. It exists. It's got 6-7% of the polls. It's got a national structure. And it would be for Boris to get involved with that. And I have my huge disagreements with Boris on many, many issues. The net zero agenda, his relaxed attitude towards vast millions coming to the country every decade. But on the real big issue, the biggest constitutional issue of our lifetime, namely Brexit, I'm on the same side as him. And if it comes to a battle for him to save his legacy, then if he wants to go on in politics, he's going to have to find solutions outside the Tory party. And I would say reform is really the best possibility.